each. I faked my death. Or at least that was the plan. And the plan was perfect. Clean. Untraceable. Right up until the moment a man reached into a lake and pulled me out of it with the grip of someone who had already decided I belonged to him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Beck Rim. And before you understand what I became, you need to understand what I lost, because everything that followed, every terrible and magnificent and ruinous thing, began with a text message at 6:47 p.m. and a phone call at 7:23 p.m. 36 minutes. In 36 minutes, my mother went from planning spinach for dinner to being covered by a white cloth in a hospital corridor. In 36 minutes, the only person in the world who had ever looked at me without calculating my value simply stopped existing. I was 19. I had no one. And grief, I discovered, is not the loud, devastating thing people describe. It is quiet. It is the funeral parlor too warm in summer, incense burning down to ash, strangers debating whether your mother's death was an accident or something else while you sit 3 feet away searching for a missing floor cushion because your mind needs something small and findable to hold on to. It is a portrait of a woman in a yellow cardigan smiling with her eyes curved like crescent moons, and knowing with complete certainty that she was planning spinach, and not being able to make those two facts exist in the same world. Then the man with the gold tooth arrived. He came to the funeral on the third day, moving through the incense smoke with 3 other suits behind him, and he bowed at the portrait with practiced ease, and then he turned and found me immediately the way eyes always found me in a room, for reasons I had learned too young and too late to change. He held out his hand. "You're Beck Hongsik's son, right?" My father's name. The name that had been an unspoken taboo in our house since I was small. The name that made my mother's face shudder closed like a window against winter. I stared at the hand. It was a wide hand, thick-fingered, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with size. I should have pulled away. I was 19 and my mother was 3 days dead and I had no one else in the world. I took the hand. 3 months later, in an apartment those men had been paying for, which should have been the first sign. I sat at a kitchen table that wasn't my table and read a number on a page that ended my life as I understood it. My father, Beck Hongsik, had borrowed money. A great deal of money. From men with gold teeth and heavy hands. And then, with the skill he had apparently been practicing since before I was born, he had vanished completely, leaving behind a son and a debt in that order. "Family obligation," the gold-toothed man said, sitting across from me with his hands open on the table like a book already turned to the relevant page. "That's just how it works." I looked at the wall behind his head. Neutral beige. I had always hated neutral beige. "I don't have money," I said. "We know," he said, not unkindly. That was almost worse. "But you have other things." That was how Madame Zhang entered my life. She was small, precise, silver-streaked, and she spoke about human transactions the way other people spoke about weather, descriptively, without judgment, with the simple understanding that conditions exist and one adapts. She told me about a wealthy man outside Seoul. Old money, large property. She said I would be comfortable. "And the debt?" I asked. "Settled. Fully." When I asked what the alternative was, she looked at me for a long moment across pale curtains and delicate teacups and said absolutely nothing. So I made my decision. I would go. I would perform. I would become whatever the white dress shirt and lowered eyes and soft voice needed me to be. And then, when the time was right, when the schedules aligned and the lake was unobserved and the trail was clean, I would disappear. Completely. Permanently. No body required. Just clothes on a pier, dark water, and a story that wrote itself. I had researched it in the quiet hours before dawn. I had a plan, and the plan made the unbearable feel temporary. I was wrong about so many things. The mansion appeared at the end of a long drive the way old things appear. Gradually, insistently, as though it had always been there and the road had grown toward it. Enormous. Western style. Preserved past its natural lifespan with moss on the pond walls and ivy trained deliberately up the stone. The whole property embalmed rather than maintained, radiating the particular heaviness of something kept alive by stubbornness alone. I stepped out of the black car with my single bag and looked at the stone facade and thought, this is a very good place to disappear from. The chairman looked at me across the dinner table that first evening the way he looked at everything he owned, with the flat assessment of inventory. I sat straight. I smiled with only my mouth. I answered questions correctly and briefly and said nothing that wasn't required. Inside, I was counting days. I found the backyard on my third morning, the unglamorous side, the part the architects hadn't bothered with. Weeds between pebbles, gray stone, the smell of old cigarette smoke and engine oil. Nobody went there. I went every day. It was the only place in that entire suffocating house where I could exist as myself, or whatever was left of myself after months of becoming someone else's. Where I could crouch in the dirt and look at weeds and let my pheromone shimmer drift without suppressing it, and feel, for a few minutes, like a person rather than a possession. I was there on a Thursday in late July when I heard footsteps. I kept my gaze down. The world often moves on if you give it nothing to catch on. The world did not move on. You should manage your pheromones, a voice said, low, unhurried, threaded with the specific amusement of someone who has decided to find you interesting. Unless you plan on spreading your legs for just anyone. I looked up. He was tall, lean, dark eyes under heavier brows with a cigarette between long veined fingers and one corner of his mouth doing something that lived near a smile without committing to it. He looked at me the way predators look at things that have gone still, not with suspicion, with interest, the kind that doesn't ask permission. I told him he looked like he had nothing better to do. He seemed genuinely, completely delighted by this. I stood up, brushed my shorts, and walked away without looking back, feeling the weight of his attention on my spine all the way to the door, like sunlight through glass. Directional, warm, entirely capable of burning. I learned his name that afternoon from the servants' careful silences. Ryu Yonho, the chairman's eldest son, returned from overseas on vacation. His room was directly above mine. I told myself I had one more week. One more week and the plan would be clean and I would be gone and none of this would matter. Then the chairman called me to his study. He spread photographs across the dark desk between us. My mother, her car, a mountain road with a broken guardrail at the edge of a cliff. Bank accounts with deposits traced through channels I didn't fully understand but felt immediately, the way you feel something before your mind catches up to what it means. The accident wasn't an accident. Arrangements had been made. People had been paid. I had been kept from knowing this because my not knowing was useful. It kept me compliant, kept me performing, kept me sitting across dinner tables with practiced smiles while the man who had orchestrated my mother's death watched me over a roasted chicken. He told me this with his hands folded on the desk, in the tone of a man settling an account. I walked back to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. They were not shaking, which surprised me. I thought about the text message. Spinach tonight, 6:47 p.m. And then I walked to the lake. The pine forest path was cool and smelled of earth. I walked slowly. I wasn't running, I had nowhere to run to. I was simply moving toward the only exit I had ever been able to find in this life that felt completely, finally, mine. The lake opened through the trees, wide, dark blue, mirror still under the summer sky. I walked to the end of the old wooden pier and looked down. The surface reflected a face I barely recognized anymore. Pale, composed. The face of a person who had been performing for so long that the performance had begun to eat the performer. I thought about the plan, the controlled disappearance, the misdirection, the clean trail. But standing there with the pier boards under my feet and the deep cold water below, I understood that what I was feeling was no longer a plan. It was something simpler, less organized, something that had stopped asking whether I meant to come back. I jumped. The water hit me like a decision made final. Cold, shockingly, centrally cold even in summer. The cold of deep things that the sun has never reached. It filled my ears and pressed against my chest and I went under, and the white of my shirt billowed upward around me like something enormous and bright releasing, and everything above the surface disappeared. I had not thought carefully about swimming. My body that had survived poverty and grief and the gold-toothed man's hand and months of performance in a mansion built on old cruelty. My body disagreed with everything my mind had decided on that pier. Panicked, flailed. It wanted, with a desperation that had nothing to do with any plan I had made, to survive. My arms churned. My lungs burned. The current pulled sideways. My clothes dragged. And the part of me that had been so calm, so deliberate, so resigned, that part went quiet as my hands began to go down. Then something grabbed me by the collar. The grip was not gentle. It hauled me upward with a force that felt like annoyance, like being retrieved by something that found the whole situation mildly inconvenient. And I came out of the water all at once, gasping, streaming, entirely undignified, and was deposited against a chest that was rapidly becoming as wet as I was. "What do you think you're doing? Trying to make someone clean up your corpse?" I knew the voice. Even through the roaring in my ears and the lake water pouring from my hair, I knew the voice. I coughed until my vision went white. Water came out of me in quantities that seemed impossible. My whole body shook. "If you're going to die," Yonho said above me, "you should at least pick the place. Even like this." Even draped half unconscious against his chest. Coughing myself inside out. Soaking wet and humiliated and still half drowned. "Why?" I managed between coughs. "Do you always speak so informally to me?" A pause. "Long enough to mean something. Is that what you say to the person who saved you?" "I never asked you to save me," I said. He held on anyway. I woke up the next morning in my own bed in dry clothes that weren't mine. A dark sleep shirt, too large at the shoulders, and I stared at the ceiling and understood that the plan was gone. Not postponed. Gone. The servant Park Hyunsuk brought kanji and told me, while speaking to the door rather than to me, that the young master had carried me back himself and asked the staff not to disturb me. I ate the kanji. I told myself it meant nothing. I avoided him for 3 days. On the 4th day he found me in the library, sitting in the window seat with a book I wasn't reading, and he sat down across from me without being invited and turned an unlit cigarette between his fingers slowly, which I was already learning meant he was thinking. "You should have left me," I said. "Probably," he said. "Why didn't you?" He turned the cigarette once more. "You're interesting." I told him I was the chairman's concubine and this conversation was a waste of his time. "I find myself disagreeing," he said, and my pheromone shimmer spiked with irritation before I could stop it. A visible golden agitation around my wrists that I couldn't suppress quickly enough. He tracked it with those heavy-lidded eyes with the calm attention of someone reading a language they have been quietly studying. "Your pheromones," he said almost gently, "are much more honest than your face." I walked out. He let me go. That was the thing about Yonho I was beginning to understand. He never chased. He simply waited with the patience of something that has correctly calculated that the distance will close on its own. The next morning he was in the backyard. My backyard. Sitting on the low stone ledge with a lit cigarette and his face tipped up toward the sky like a man who had accidentally wandered into exactly the right place. I stopped in the doorway. "You're in my spot," I said. "I know," he said, to the sky. I should have gone back inside. Every reasonable calculation pointed toward it. Instead, I crossed the yard and sat down on the ground 3 meters away from him and looked at the weeds. We sat in silence. Not the strategic silence of the library, something closer to the kind that exists between people who have run out of defenses and are simply occupying the same air. A cicada started somewhere in the garden. "Why do you come out here?" he asked eventually. "Same reason you do, probably," I said. He looked at me. Actually looked. Not the predator's assessment. Something more level. Something that asked a question without asking it. "The house is suffocating," I said, before I could stop myself. A pause. "Yes," he said. Just that. One word. But it landed with the weight of someone telling the truth about something they don't usually admit, and I felt something shift in the air between us. Something small but irreversible, the way a crack appears in something that looked solid. He crushed the cigarette under his foot and didn't leave. Neither did I. This was how it started. Not with the lake, not with the library. With 2 people sitting 3 meters apart in an ugly backyard because the house was suffocating and the air outside was the only honest thing available. Yinwu found us there on the 3rd morning. He was 9 years old, the chairman's younger son, born to a mother who had died young and a father who had never once acted like one. He appeared at the backyard door with his worn red sketchbook under his arm and ink stains on his fingers, and looked at the two of us with the bright assessing eyes of a child who has learned to read rooms very carefully. Then he walked over and sat down between us on the ground as though this had always been the arrangement. "What are you drawing?" I asked. He showed me the sketchbook. Pages of trees, mostly. Meticulous, careful. The trees rendered with a patience that seemed too large for 9 years. "I like pretty things," he said simply. I looked at him for a moment, at the round cheeks and the stubborn cowlick and the ink-stained small hands, and felt something move through me that I didn't have a name for. Something that was not grief exactly but lived in the same general neighborhood. "Me too," I said. Yonho, on the other side of the child, said nothing, but I felt his eyes on my face, reading something there that I hadn't intended to show. The chairman summoned me that same evening, and I went as I always went, and I performed as I always performed. But something had shifted. The performance felt thinner than usual, more like a costume than a skin, more like something I was wearing than something I was. Afterward, in the corridor, I pressed my back against the cold paneling and closed my eyes. I thought about the backyard, about one word, yes, carrying the weight of shared truth. About a 9-year-old sitting between us like a small living declaration of something uncomplicated and real. I thought about how no one in this house, not Madame Zhang, not the chairman, not the gold-toothed man, had ever looked at me the way Yonho looked at me. Not as inventory, not as a transaction, not as a debt settled or a name in a ledger. As something genuinely, specifically, inconveniently interesting. I pushed off the wall. I straightened my shirt. I walked to my room. I did not sleep. The summer deepened. Days accumulated the way they do when you are no longer counting toward an exit. Differently, with more texture, the hours heavier and also somehow more real. I learned the mansion's rhythms the way you learn a difficult piece of music. Not by understanding it, but by repeating it until your body knows which way to move before your mind does. I learned that the chairman ate alone when he was in a dark mood and summoned me when he was in a different kind of mood, and that reading the difference between these states was a survival skill I had become very good at. I learned that the servants moved in precise orbits that rarely intersected with mine in the backyard or the library. I learned that Yinwo would appear wherever I was if given the opportunity, and that his small serious presence was the closest thing to uncomplicated this house contained. And I learned, against every reasonable intention I had, the particular geography of Ryu Yonho. That he smoked most heavily in the morning and least at night. That he was in the library when he was avoiding something and in the backyard when he had stopped avoiding it. That he watched his younger brother with a gentleness so different from his default expression that seeing it the first time felt like walking through a door into a different building. That he spoke carefully and sparsely, and that every word he chose to use was the right one, which meant his silences were as precise as his speech. That when he looked at me, specifically at me, not at the performance or the pheromones or the white shirt, his eyes carried something that I had no safe name for and had been trying very hard not to examine directly. I was examining it directly. I was doing it constantly. I was doing it right now, sitting 3 meters away from him in the backyard on a Tuesday afternoon, while the cicadas made their noise and the summer light slanted gold across the weeds. "Stop," I said. "Stop what?" he said, looking at me like that. He was quiet for a moment. "Like what?" he asked, with the specific innocence of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. "Like you're trying to figure something out." "I am," he said. "Figure it out somewhere else. I find this location convenient." I pulled my knees closer to my chest. My pheromone shimmer spiked and I let it. The irritation was genuine and suppressing it required effort I didn't feel like spending today. "What is it you think you're figuring out?" I asked, and immediately wished I hadn't, because questions invite answers and I was not sure I was ready for his. He turned to look at me fully. Not the side glance, not the peripheral hunting attention. Full, direct, the heavy-lidded eyes carrying something steady and considered. "Why you're still here," he said. The words landed differently than I expected. Not an accusation, a genuine question. As though he had looked at all the evidence. The lake, the photographs in the study, the performance I ran every day for his father, and arrived at a puzzle he couldn't resolve. "I don't have a choice," I said. Everyone has a choice, he said. You've never not had one, I said. That's why you can say that. The silence that followed was different from the others. Fuller. Something in it that was not comfortable but was not hostile either. The silence of two people who have said something true and are sitting with the fact of it. No, he said finally, quietly. That's fair. I looked at him. And the thing I had been trying not to examine directly examined itself all at once with no consideration for my preferences, because Ryu Yonho had just admitted he was wrong about something, had heard a correction and accepted it, had said that's fair with the ease of someone unburdened by the need to win. In this house where every interaction was a transaction and every kindness was a down payment and every look was an appraisal. That's fair. I looked back at the weeds. My hands were not shaking. I wished, briefly, that they were. It would have been easier to dismiss as simple fear. It was Yinwoo who broke the pattern. He came running to the backyard one afternoon faster than his usual deliberate walk, sketchbook clutched to his chest, and he looked at his brother with the specific expression of a child delivering news that is both urgent and confusing. Father is asking for Siramesasai, he said, slightly breathless. Yonho's expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes did. A slight cooling, a reorganization, the careful neutrality of someone setting aside whatever they were thinking and replacing it with something more functional. Go, he said to me. Not dismissive. Something more careful than that. I stood. I brushed my shorts. I felt the weight of both of them watching me walk back toward the mansion. Yinwoo with his open curious face and his sketchbook and his uncomplicated worry, and Yonho with his cigarette and his eyes that had just said that's fair and his presence that I could feel on my back all the way to the door. I went inside. I performed. I was very good at it. But something had changed, something small and structural and irreversible, like the first crack in a wall that looks solid, and I could feel it in the space behind my ribs where the performance used to sit undisturbed. That night I lay on the carved post bed and looked at the ceiling, which was Yonho's floor, and I allowed myself, for the first time since arriving at this mansion, to ask the question I had been very carefully not asking. What if I didn't disappear? Not forever. Not as a plan. Just as a question. As a hypothetical held at arm's length and examined without committing to it. What if I stayed? What if the plan I had built in the dark hours before dawn, the lake, the pier, the clean trail, the erasure of Bexio Rim, what if that plan had been wrong? Not wrong because my body refused it, not wrong because a man's hand reached into the water, but wrong because it assumed that nothing here was worth remaining for. What if that assumption was wrong? I heard a sound above me. Footsteps on the wooden floor, Yonho moving in his room directly above mine. A pause, then stillness. I pressed my palm against the ceiling. Cold plaster, the boundary between his space and mine. I thought about that's fair. I thought about your interesting delivered without agenda, without transaction, without the grammar of ownership. I thought about the lake and the grip, and the too large dark sleep shirt that smelled of cigarette smoke and something clean and sharp that I had folded and put in the back of the wardrobe instead of returning because I was not ready to examine why. I moved my hand away from the ceiling. I closed my eyes. Outside the window, the summer night was full of cicadas singing themselves to death for the chance to exist. And I lay in the dark of a mansion that was trying to own me and thought about a man who had reached into deep water without asking permission and pulled me back into the world whether I wanted it or not. And somewhere between one breath and the next, without deciding to, I was glad he had.